Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are at. This is Dr. Sanchez, and I will be teaching this course. And we have a fantastic book. I think many of you will keep this throughout your career. Dr. NORTHOUSE is one of the predominant researchers in leadership. And his book is Leadership Theory and Practice, and we are on the 8th edition. And the 8th edition is very different than his previous editions because there's been more and more research in the topic of leadership. So as those theories come out, as those studies come out, Dr. NORTHOUSE really adds them to his book. So let's see what we're going to go over in chapter 1. And I highly recommend that you read each chapter. They're very short, but these PowerPoints will also give you a really good overview. So we're going to talk about the importance of leadership, how leadership is defined, and how leadership is described. So here's the evolution of leadership definitions. And we've been studying leadership since the 1900s. And the book gives you each year and what the approach was and what the thinking was around leadership. Really, it was the 1980s where the explosion of research started to happen. And we started thinking, okay, are leaders made? Do you have natural leadership skills? Or can they be developed? And are there certain traits that you have to be a leader? Or do you need influencing skills to be a leader? So it's fascinating, and I think for all of you students, you need to really think about leadership and what that means to you. And by the way, the book also gives you in the back that certain tests you can take. I'm sorry, not the back, each chapter of what kind of leadership test you can take. And they're fascinating. And I encourage you to do that during this session. So, the 21st century is also an explosion of research, but we've come down to define it in certain elements. So, authentic leadership. Well, what does that mean? It's that they are real, right? That they are willing to show their strengths and their developmental opportunities, that they are individuals that can be humble, but aren't really afraid of letting their followers see who they really are. And spiritual leaders, they focus really on their values and the sense of calling, and they want members to be motivated by their leadership. Think about Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa, or maybe your pastor. Those are examples of spiritual leadership. And then this servant leadership, this one has really taken hold in companies like Southwest Airlines, where it puts the leader in the role of being a servant who has caring principles and focuses on their followers and allowing them, their followers, to have more knowledge, and that the leader is more like serving them. So this one is fascinating, and there's a chapter on each of these, by the way, so we're going to learn each of them individually. Adaptive leadership. Those are leaders that can be adapted to their situation. If they're confronting a problem, that they encourage their followers to solve the problem, or if the situation has changed, or there's challenges or changes, the adaptive leader helps the followers to adapt, and then he or she adapts their style to help the followers with each of these challenges. Fellowship. It puts the spotlight on followers, and that the role of followers play in the leadership process. So what do the followers feel? What are the followers thinking? And that leader listens to what they're talking about or their ideas, and really doesn't take credit for them, but puts the credit all on the followers. And the discursive leadership. This one's a theory that the leadership is created not so much through traits or skills or behaviors, but through the communication process, and that they're negotiated between the leader and follower. So this one's a very different one, and we'll learn a lot more about it. So, some definitions. This is conceptualizing leadership. Some definitions view of leadership is the focus on a group process, that the personality needs to be involved, how to act or behave, the power of relationships between leaders and followers, that it's a transformational process. It's a skills perspective. These are all things that we study that may impact leadership. So your book goes into detail about what these mean, but just think about these as, is this part of the process in becoming a leader, or is this an effect of the leader? So very interesting in conceptualizing leadership. So here's what leadership is defined. It's a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. So who comes to mind to me, right, is Martin Luther King, an individual who influenced a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. And what was the common goal of Martin Luther King? It was to lead the African American ideals and hopes and dreams by changing laws and not using violence. So that's one example of leadership. What I want you to think about here is who comes to mind when you look at a leader. What individuals come to mind that influence a group of individuals to achieve a common goal? All right, so here's the components and the that are central to the phenomenon of leadership. So there's leadership, which is a process. It involves influence. It occurs within a group. So a group can have leadership, and it tends to common goals. And then there's the leaders, the individuals, and followers are involved together, and followers need each other and often initiate and maintain the relationship and are not above or better than their followers. So leadership described. Okay, so what was the trait theory? And we're going to learn about that versus leadership, or trait versus the process of leadership. And there's assigned versus emergent leader, and there's leadership in power, leadership in coercion, and leadership in management. And we're going to go over those in the next following slides. So, the trait theory. This was back in the 50s or 60s. This means you can't be a leader unless you got the certain height, right? Or you were intelligent. You were an extrovert, that you had good command of the English language, right? It was all traits that an individual may have had, right, that impacted their followers. So process definition of leadership is you have a leader and you have a follower, and there's an interaction between the two. So there's a process between the two, and it goes back and forth. But the trait leadership is one way. You got the leader, and it impacts the followers. The process definition of leadership is there's leaders and there's followers, and it can go up and down. So that's what the difference is between the trait definition and the process definition. Okay, so leadership is a property of set of properties possessed in varying degrees. So Jago in 1982, he observed behaviors, but you know, and he said it could be learned, that leadership could be learned. Now, let me explain about all of these studies. There can be conflicting studies. There can be different studies. What studies do is give us another opportunity to think about leadership, or think about what could affect people through the leadership process. All right, what's assigned versus emergent? And this is another very interesting differentiation. So, assigned leadership is based on occupying a position within an organization. So you know this, right? Title, right? Team leaders, plant managers, your boss, department heads, directors, right? They're occupying a position, the CEO, the CFO. Emergent leadership is an individual perceived by others as the most influential member of a group or organization, regardless of their title. So it merges over time through communication behaviors. So it can be one person in a group who is part of a group that emerges as maybe that group leader, because they have great communication skills. They're verbal, they are informed, they seek others' opinions, they're firm but not rigid. And so studies have shown that this can be affected by personality and gender. So the book has an interesting two studies that one found that an individual who were more dominant, more intelligent, more confident, were more likely to be identified as a leader in their group. And then there was a study about women that if they were able to persuade their group by having high quality decisions, they were more likely to succeed as that leader and become more influential. So there's, like I said, different studies that may prove different things. All right, now let's talk about leadership and power. So power is the capacity or potential to influence. So that can be your manager, right? Ability to affect others' beliefs, attitudes, and actions. And so power is a relational concern for both the leaders and the followers. So people who have power are able to affect others' beliefs, attitudes, and course of action. So these are people like doctors, coaches, judges, who have that ability to maybe affect how you believe or your attitudes about certain things. Now, what about social power? And social power, there's 6 bases for power. They're reverent, they're expert, they're legitimate, reward, coercive, and information. So here they are. So reverent power is based on the follower's identification and liking for the people. For example, a teacher is adored by students as reverent power. This can be also pastors, right? Pastors have reverent power because they maybe have followers that adore them. Expert power is based on the follower's perception of a leader's competence. For example, a tour guide who is knowledgeable about a foreign country has expert power. Many individuals believe that Steve Jobs had both expert power and coercive power, but he was known as the expert in creativeness, and his partner who developed all the technology, he was expert power because he knew exactly what to do to run the technology at Apple. Legitimate power associated with having status and a formal job authority, a judge who administers sentences in the courtroom, right, exhibits legitimate power. A CEO has legitimate power. Reward power derived from having the capacity to provide rewards to others. A supervisor who gives rewards to employees who work hard is using reward power. Maybe it's your manager who gives you bonuses or merit increases. That also could be reward power they're using. Coercive power, I talked about Steve Jobs, but another example of a coercive power was Adolf Hitler or Jim Jones. Those people had coercive power. They had the capacity to penalize or punish others. And then there's information power, derived by possessing knowledge that others want or need. A boss who has information regarding new criteria to decide employee promotions, eligibility, has information power. Secretaries or administrative assistants to a high-level individual, like the CEO or the CFO, administrative assistants may have information power because they've seen things that you haven't seen. All right, so they're split up in these ways: leadership and power. Position power is derived by the office, the rank, and the organization. We already went through that. And then personal power is influence, derived from being seen as likable or have personal power or knowledgeable. Okay, so shifts in power. So Kellerman did a study, right? And there's going to be a lot of studies throughout this book. But he believed that power is no longer the domain of leaders, right? That other individuals can have power besides organizational leaders with the title. Followers can demand more from their leaders. And we're seeing that more and more as we work on these team groups in organizations. Individuals have access to technology, and that has empowered followers. So they have access to as much information as maybe their leaders. And leaders are becoming more transparent, hopefully, or more authentic. And there has been a decline in the respect for leaders. And we've seen that when politicians have fallen because of their actions, and basically some of the pastors have also done that. They've lost respect from congregations because of what they've done. And so leadership is more of a social contract between leaders and followers. So let's talk about leadership and coercion. And I think we've talked about this, right? It's using force to affect change and manipulating rewards and penalties in the work environment, using threats and negative rewards. And there is Adolf Hitler, Jim Jones, and the Taliban leaders, right? Power and restraint is used to force followers to engage in extreme behavior. Kotter is another theorist that talks about the difference between leadership and management. And there are differences. So management produces order and consistency. And when we learn about management, we learn that planning and budgeting and organizing and staffing and controlling and problem solving are all part of the management activities that managers are supposed to do. But leadership produces change and movement. And that's very different than management activities. So in planning and budgeting, we establish agendas and set timetables and allocate resources. But establishing direction under leadership activities is creating a clear vision, clarifying the big vision to the followers, and setting strategies. On the management activities, organizing and staffing includes providing structure, making job placements, establishing rules and procedures. But on the leadership activities, aligning people is communicating goals, seeking commitment, building teams and coalitions. When you're talking about management and controlling and problem solving, you're developing incentives and generating creative solutions and taking corrective action. But when you're doing leadership, you're motivating. When you're doing leadership activities, you're motivating and inspiring people to become energized and empowering followers and satisfying their unmet needs. So remember that the major activities of management and leadership are played out differently, but they're both an essential function for an organization to prosper. So, managers, leaders, we've talked about all of these, that unidirectional authority under management is they're reactive, they're prefer to work with people solving, and they have a low emotional involvement. So are some of you thinking about some of the managers in your company that are unidirectional authority managers? And again, this was a study done in 1977. So they're reactive. They prefer to work with people solving problems. They prefer to work with people solving all kinds of problems, and they have low emotional involvement. Now, multi-directional influencers or leaders are emotionally active and involved, and we'll talk about emotional intelligence, and they shape ideas over responding to them, and they act to expand available options, and they change the way people think about what's possible. So I hope you've found all of these ideas through this chapter a good way to think about leadership. I'm looking forward to working with you all, and I hope you have enjoyed this webcast.